I think we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much again for joining us at Fair Housing Futures, fulfilling the Fair Housing Act's promise through the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule. I'm so excited to be with you all today to learn more about the AFFH rule. We're going to give an overview of what it is. We're going to give an overview of the Fair Housing Act. We will discuss the history of the proposed rule, why it's important, what it's about, and what we're fighting for right now. So I'm excited to introduce my co-panelists. Today we have Michael Santos, who is from Results Educational Fund. He's the associate director there and works with passionate grassroots advocates who use their voices to influence political decisions on critical federal housing policies that will bring an end to poverty. I am Rasheedah Phillips. I'm with PolicyLink as Director of Housing. I lead PolicyLink's national advocacy to support the growing tenants' rights, housing, and land use movements in partnership with grassroots partners, movement leaders, industry, and government leaders. Next, we'll have Josh Dubensky. Josh works for SAGE, where he advocates for the needs of LGBTQ+ elders in housing policy. And then we also have Liz Ryan Murray, who's the Director of Strategic Campaigns at Public Advocates. Liz joined Public Advocates in 2017 as the Project Director for the Alliance for Housing Justice. And then last but not least, we have Morgan Williams, who is responsible for leading the National Fair Housing Alliance's strategic and tactical legal initiatives and affairs. So you'll be hearing from each of those folks today. Before we get into the program today, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping reminders. One, the webinar will be recorded. We'll be sending it out and making it available to everyone afterwards. We also have ASL interpreters. We are fortunate to be joined by Pro Bono ASL today, who will be doing ASL interpretation for the webinar. We also have closed caption below. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says closed captioning so that you can look at that as well if needed. And then finally, we will also share the slides. And there is a Q&A function. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to throw them in there. And also, we'd love to have folks introduce themselves. So feel free to add your name into the chat, where you're from, what interests you have, or why the AFFH is important to you or to your community as well. So just to give a quick overview of what we're here about today, actually, I'll pass it to Michael to share the agenda for today.
Thanks, Rasheedah, and nice to be here with all of you. Thanks so much for joining. Again, I'm Michael Santos. I'm the Associate Director of Results. I'm also the current chair of the American Bar Association's Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. For those of you who cannot see me, I'm a brown Filipino guy with really short hair, wearing a white shirt with blue pinstripes. Really glad to be joining all of you today. So to rehash what Rasheedah had mentioned, we have a lot of ground to cover today. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to talk about making sense of the AFFH rule. Where does this fit in the broader context of federal laws and policies, just to ground ourselves in that conversation. We're going to talk about what is AFFH, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule, and a quick history of AFFH, how we got to here, and why we're talking to all of you today. We're also going to provide an overview of the proposed rule, why this rule matters, what it's trying to address, what would happen without this rule. We'll also provide you with some examples of how grassroots organizers and advocates have been involved with the AFFH rule, and then proceed with an overview of opposition and challenges so that you also know what you're up against. And then we'll talk about what the problem is and why you should be concerned, give you some political context on what's happening, and then last but not least, we'll talk about our calls to action and how you can actually get involved after today's webinar. And then we'll close this out with some Q&A. And we actually left a lot of time to do some questions and answers. So please, I encourage all of you, to Rasheedah's point earlier, ask a lot of questions. The AFFH rule, we're simplifying today, but we encourage a lot of folks to ask a lot of questions. If things are unclear, we really encourage you to ask those questions, put those in the Q&A, and we'll leave a lot of time towards the end to answer some of those questions. So In terms of the goals, there are two main things we want you to walk away, right? We want you to walk away with a basic understanding of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule and why it's important, why you should get involved in advocacy to getting it implemented. And then we also want you to walk away with clear action steps and talking points on how to engage your lawmakers and other advocates and stakeholders on affirmatively furthering fair housing. So in the course of our short time together, we also want to hear from you and get to know you. So Rasheedah had encouraged you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Please feel free to do so. And again, if you have any questions, put that on the Q&A chat, Q&A box. And so we have a few questions to ask of you before we move on with our programming. And these are just questions to get to know you and get your feedback about today's webinar. And just as a heads up, we'll have a few questions at the beginning and towards the end of our time together. So thank you for launching the poll. I'm going to read it out loud for those of you who have trouble seeing it. But the first question is, how much do you agree with the following statement? I have knowledge or I am familiar with the affirmatively furthering fair housing proposed rule. And your choices are you strongly disagree, you're neutral, you agree, or you strongly agree. The second question is, how much do you agree with the following statement? I have experience advocating on the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And again, same choices, strongly disagree, you disagree, you're neutral, you agree, or you strongly agree. So we'll give it another 15 seconds for folks to fill this in, and then we'll move right along.
Okay, we have about 74% participation. Let's get it up a little bit.
Sure, yeah. Give it a few more seconds, and then we can close it out. And maybe there's a way that we can share.
Yes. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to end the poll.
Great. So it seems like a lot of you are, still have some familiarity, and many of you also, are unfamiliar with the affirmatively furthering fair housing. So hopefully you'll find today's webinar insightful, informative, and helpful in your advocacy. Okay, so moving right along. So before we move with the rest of our panel, I want to ground today's conversation by making sense of the AFFH rule and really today's ask and call to action. In particular, I want to address where does AFFH rule fit in the broader context of federal laws and policies. To do so, we need to go back to basics. Remember that there are three branches of the federal government: federal courts or the judiciary, the executive branch, currently the Biden administration and its federal agencies, and the legislative branch, which is Congress. Typically, when we seek to pass laws, rules, and policies, we turn to Congress. But the other branches of the federal government, namely the judiciary or the courts and the executive branch, also play a role in passing laws and policies that apply to everyone or to certain groups. What we're dealing with here today, the AFFH rule, is a rule proposed by the executive branch or the administration. It is not yet a final rule. There's a process involved in making this a final rule, which is what we'll be asking of you today. And we'll go over that ask later during the webinar. Now, even though this rule is from the executive branch, specifically a rule proposed by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, it has a relationship with other branches of the federal government. So let's start with Congress. Congress passed a law, also known as the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting or buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in other housing-related activities. So under the Fair Housing Act, you cannot be discriminated based on your race, color, national origin, religion, sex, which includes gender identity and sexual orientation, familial status, or disability. When Congress passes a law, its implementation is left to the federal agencies in the executive branch of the federal government. And this is where the US Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing proposed rule come into play. One way to think about this is the AFFH rule is one way you can operationalize and implement the spirit of the Fair Housing Act. Courts have also played a role in interpreting the Fair Housing Act and the AFFH rule. I'm not going to get into the details of the role of the courts in litigation around AFFH rule and the Fair Housing Act, but I want to merely highlight that courts also play a role in all of this. And all of this to say that there are ways advocates can engage the three branches of the federal government to implement and to enforce the Fair Housing Act and the AFFH rule. The focus of our ask, which will be discussed later, is to use your voices and your advocacy with Congress to push the White House, the Biden administration, to release the AFFH proposed rule. As constituents of lawmakers in Congress, you have a lot of sway and influence on your members to talk to the White House. So hopefully that made sense, and I'm now going to transition it to my colleague, Liz Ryan-Murray, to talk about the AFFH rule, its history, and how we got to where we are now.
Thank you, Michael. I'm actually going to bounce over to Rasheedah to do a little bit of background, and then we'll go to me. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm going to share slides again. Oops, not that sharing. So just want to re-emphasize a few points that I made earlier and some of the points that Michael shared around why the AFFH is important, what it is. Essentially, right, the AFFH rule implements the Fair Housing Act's Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing mandate. It does that by requiring state and local communities and housing authorities to identify and address fair housing issues. Prior to the 2015 AFFH rule, which was the rule that was implemented under the Obama administration, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing mandate was pretty unevenly enforced. There was a process called the analysis of impediments that jurisdictions had to do, jurisdictions that receive HUD funds, but rarely did they do them. If they did do them, rarely did they turn them in. If they did turn them in, rarely was it, reviewed or enforced or utilized for much of anything. A lot of that changed under the 2015 AFFH rule, and that created a process that encouraged data-driven analysis, regional and cross-sector collaboration. And one of the most important parts of it was that it required community engagement, and it required community expertise. It required jurisdictions to go to the communities, hear from them what was wrong, what was going on in their communities, and to hear the solutions that those communities proposed. So it really enforced that through the process. And then that rule also required through that process communities to do an assessment of fair housing, which are important avenues for policy change at the local level. And so this says cities, but it was also regions and housing authorities as well who had to do the assessments of fair housing process. And the AFFH rule was intended to help HUD grantees be able to weave together things like housing, health, transportation, education, environmental and economic development approaches, all things that support the transformation of areas of concentrated poverty into thriving communities, right? So although, right, it is focused on housing and focused on accessing, being able to access housing and to strip away the barriers that have been entrenched in our communities for people to be able to access housing, right? It recognizes that housing is not just a silo. Housing is connected to every other facet of life in terms of economics and jobs and transportation, education, health, all of those things. And so the rule really encourages that cross-sector collaboration in order to figure out what are the barriers to accessing housing across different areas, and then to be able to, again, create the solutions that communities locally, that local communities need in order to resolve or address those barriers. And then, again, why do we need that rule, right? Because again, it's not just about housing itself, but all the things that connect to housing and to our ability to access housing. So where we live, as we know, determines our access to jobs. It determines our access to education, to transit that's reliable, health and social services, healthy food, credit, environmental health, all of those things. And we know that the policies from yesterday continue to impact us today. Things like redlining, all of those things are not just features of the past, but they flow into the present and they impact us and have an impact on our disparities today. And so that's why the AFFH rule is needed for us to have healthier, safer, more accessible housing futures, more just and more equitable housing futures. So now that's it for me. I'm going to turn it back to Liz to share more.
Thanks, Rasheedah. So we're going to show a little video and be on the lookout and see if you can tell from this video when it was made. And I'll give a little bit of a background to it, but it gives you a little bit of how we got here, why this law is here, a little bit of more context, and then we'll talk about that. Rasheedah, if you don't mind playing.
We all want to live in a place where we can feel at home. But the U.S. has a long history of housing discrimination, where our color, our gender, our disabilities, or the number of kids we have has been used to limit our opportunities. We've come a long way because of civil rights laws like the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in the wake of Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. It makes it illegal to deny someone housing based on who they are. These protections are critical to how we make our country a place where freedom and fairness are for everyone. No exceptions. But the people who fought for and passed the law understood that just outlawing the most obvious discrimination does not get us where we need to be. They made sure the Fair Housing Act included a duty for the government to affirmatively further fair housing. It means that any place that gets our shared public investments must show how they are working to end housing discrimination and its impacts. But not everyone wants this to work. Racist homeowners who fight to keep the people out of their neighborhoods, big corporate developers and landlords, and the politicians in their pockets have fought against progress. At the same time, they're attacking vital protections that people rely on, like rent control, basic labor standards, and laws to keep our air and water clean. All over the country, diverse people have come together in the fight to make our communities a place where everyone belongs. The big money special interests are scared of the power of the people. They should be. We know that the many can defeat the money when we stand united. Join us in fighting back. Go to allianceforhousingjustice.org to learn how to make your voice heard to protect fair housing and justice for all.
Thanks. And actually, I was more on top of it than I thought, and this is the newer version.
all
The
want
old
to live
version.
in a place where we can.
Thank you. The old version actually says, but the Trump administration is working to get rid of this rule. And the spoiler alert is they did. They came in, the Trump administration and Ben Carson actually campaigned on this. And it really shows the value of this rule. This rule is incredibly powerful. This rule is actually revolutionary in that it says you can't just stop. You have to fix what's broken. Rasheedah went over that to some extent. So the Biden administration, when they came in, they started to reinstate the rule, but they did it in two parts. The first part is done. The second part is what we're talking about today, which is the real implementation of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing in ways that will make it stick. I'm actually going to pass it over to Morgan right now. And if you could take that slide down, that's for a little bit later. Thanks, Rasheedah. I'm going to pass it over to Morgan, who's going to talk about, so what's in this rule that we're fighting for to get out right now?
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all, and in particular our partners and our hosts, PolicyLink. Thank you for hosting this event for us. I'm Morgan Williams, General Counsel with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and I was asked to present very briefly an overview of the proposed new Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing regulation. I did put 2 links in the chat. One is the regulation itself. This was issued last spring, and there were comments that were provided to HUD in regards to the proposed rule. HUD then accepted those comments and internally finalized a rule that it then sent to the Office of Management and Budget, this other agency where final rules are processed before they're finalized. And it was sent there in December. And so there's a final rule that's now ready to be issued, and it's accepted comments and it's ready to be finalized. And what we're asking is that this administration issue this rule. And so the second link in the chat there is just to a brief summary that we prepared last spring about an overview of the proposed rule, which itself is somewhat long, but has some highlights in that second link. And very briefly, I'll just say that the proposed regulation, in furtherance of these principles that, Rasheedah and others in particular provided an overview on under the law, the proposed regulation seeks to further implement this statutory mandate by requiring and assisting HUD program participants, that is, those entities that are large in size, over 50,000, and states, and in some instances, other large sub-jurisdictions, but also including public housing authorities, those entities, those HUD program participants, it requires and assists them to embed fairness and equity in their decision-making processes, especially with respect to their use of HUD funds, of federal financial assistance and resources. Essentially, it's a local planning rule that requires, like these larger cities and states, to prepare equity plans. And basically, these cities and states must conduct this analysis that involves public participation of issues within their geographic areas, of fair housing issues within their geographic areas. They have to prioritize these issues, and they have to set goals to address these issues in the course of the HUD-funded programming that they're otherwise undertaking. Areas of focus that they have to consider in preparing these equity plans include integration and segregation, racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, significant disparities in access to opportunity, and other factors. After these cities and states prepare these plans, they submit them to HUD for review. The proposed rule establishes a process where members of the public can file complaints with HUD if they believe that one of these plans has failed to comply with the regulation and really consider the issues within the local jurisdiction that it needs to. And once HUD has accepted a plan, it will then monitor the jurisdiction over time in its implementation of the plan. And these plans, in line with the regulation that Rasheedah referred to from 2015 that was implemented, are meant to inform the jurisdiction's subsequent planning documents and how they put together their applications for HUD funds. And so in that way, it's a real powerful vehicle for ensuring that those HUD funds, which have for so many years driven segregation, can now be utilized in a way that promotes housing choice and promotes thoughtful use of those funds in investing in areas that have been uninvested in. So this local planning process is really embedded in this framework that the regulation describes and requires. And that's what we're asking for this administration to issue. Before turning it over to my colleagues, I'll just say one last comment, that is currently HUD's 2021 interim final rule restoring affirmatively furthering fair housing definitions and certifications is in place and requires program participants to submit certifications that they're furthering fair housing in their work. But the framework under the regulation will really provide the support that local jurisdictions need to do that in a meaningful manner. Thank you.
All right. And so thanks for my colleagues for going over the overview. And it's important because for years, housing policy and advocacy has failed to fully live up to the promise of the Fair Housing Act. SAGE works on behalf of LGBTQ plus older adults, but they are just one of many communities that have struggled to access safe and affordable housing. Because simply passing a law that says you cannot discriminate is just the first step, really. There are so many more actions after which that need to take place for these promises to be upheld. Weak enforcement of certain federal rules and less focus on community-driven advocacy made it easy for groups to be overlooked, pushed aside, or ignored. Whether it was communities finding ways to keep out individuals based on their race or ethnicity, toleration of policies that isolated and attacked the LGBTQ plus community, or the adoption of rules that demonize those facing or experiencing housing instability. The federal government failed in many ways to uplift and support the voices of advocates fighting for safe and equitable housing. But as has been discussed today, AFFH provides a renewed promise to help ensure robust community participation in the housing process. Although the rule is federal, it is implemented regionally and locally. When fully embraced, it can help ensure the needs of communities long left out of the housing policy debate can finally be heard. We can look to the successes we saw when the first AFFH rule was implemented under the Obama administration. For example, Boston implemented an AFFH process with robust community meetings, public testimony, and a citywide survey. Advocates were truly listened to, which resulted in Boston updating its zoning codes to become one of the first major cities to require large development projects to include strategies for achieving affirmatively furthering fair housing goals. The new zoning codes require development projects to consider the impact on community members and to take steps to reduce potential harmful effects and provide new housing opportunities. And in 2016, Philadelphia's AFFH process ushered in a community engagement campaign that brought in new voices of those with lived experience. This process helped the city to hear about their need for increased representation for low-income tenants in a way they had not been before. And it ultimately resulted in advocates winning the right to counsel in eviction proceedings in certain areas of the city. In Chicago, after the city approved the relocation of a metal shredding operation to a largely non-white neighborhood, environmental justice advocates filed a fair housing complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Although the location of an industrial facility may not appear to fall under housing discrimination, advocates embraced the broad spirit of AFFH and recognized there are many policies and factors that contribute to the health and stability of a community. The fair housing complaint ultimately led HUD to declare that the city's effort to move the site violated the Civil Rights Act. As a result, not only was the move blocked, but new regulations were implemented to better govern the relocation of industrial sites into low-income areas. The successes we saw in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago showed us the potential of AFFH. And that was when we only had the rule on the federal level for a relatively short amount of time. Imagine the impact it could have on communities were it to be implemented permanently. From the LGBTQ perspective, advocates could make clear why all new housing needs to meet LGBTQ plus affirming standards that create safe housing for all sexual orientations and gender identity. AFFH also offers opportunities to level the playing field for LGBTQ plus communities of color who continue to see funding for safe and affirming housing flow into whiter and wealthier neighborhoods. And it is a chance to address the many dangers the trans community faces when trying to access shelters or permanent housing, with many choosing to live on the street rather than risk the dangers of HUD funding shelters. AFFH provides an avenue for advocates who have long struggled to be heard in the fair housing movement, whether it is protecting the right to fresh air and clean water for Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, ensuring equal access for fair housing resources in rural communities, or strengthening the rights of those facing housing instability, ensuring that the members of the disability community are able to access accessible housing as well as affordable housing. If advocates are ready, AFFH is an historic opportunity to expand how communities think about fair housing and shape policy going forward. It's an opportunity for HUD and the government to hear that housing advocates are not a monolith, and all communities have varying experiences and backgrounds that will need to be heard when implementing this policy. Now, of course, a change this monumental, which has this opportunity for change, has many vocal opponents. And to talk about that, I will turn it over to my colleague Liz to talk about the kind of opposition we're up against.
Thanks so much, Josh. And Rasheedah, if you could put that slide up just for a little remember back. So this can all sound pretty wonky, right? And I really appreciate Josh actually running through some of the examples of how this can work. It's really important to see, again, even in the short amount of time we had it, how much was able to get done. Sometimes when something seems wonky or off, you can tell how powerful it is and how important it is by how hard people fight back against it and frankly lie about it. This provision is powerful. This rule brings power to the people. As Josh was running through and Rasheedah was talking about, it really involves people's communities and what happens to their communities. And there are some people who do not like that. And so they use this as a way to play up on racist fears in the service of developers and others who don't want to share power, and others who are perfectly happy with the status quo, who like all those barriers, who are making money because all those barriers exist. They want to stop this. Up on the screen are, you may remember this. This was from particularly hit a high level right in the last election, the 2020 election. Trump talked a lot about they're coming for the suburbs. They're coming from you. It was played on Fox News. There were National Review articles. All of this stuff that I think is, it isn't even fair to call it a racist dog whistle. It's so loud. It's more like a racist air horn. And it was all about AFFH. It was about the fear of what happens when you actually give folks the power to have an impact in their communities and really be able to bring across the whole gamut of things we talked about: transportation, obviously housing, education, economic development, in a concerted effort to affirmatively further those things. Those folks are still in the mix, and they're still trying to keep this rule from getting finalized. And they're still trying to use this to increasingly whip up racist backlash, white supremacist backlash. So we have to understand, as we're doing this, this isn't a small little corner of fair housing law that nobody's paying attention to. People are paying attention. And so we absolutely have to mount a real positive, real forceful advocacy to make sure this gets out and gets in place. To talk about some ways you can do that, I'm going to pass it back over to Rasheedah.
All right, so how can you take action to make sure that this rule comes out? So if y'all remember last year, for those of you who were involved, we did a bunch of work, right? We submitted as a community, right? Submitted over 500 comments on the AFFH rule, to get it to be the rule that we need it to be, the rule that will be useful for our communities to get the things that we need to increase fair housing and access to housing. So we want to see that rule come out, right? This is what we need right now. We need that rule to come out so that it can get implemented and we can start the processes of creating equity plans and planning for our communities. And so how do we do that? We want you all to tell your member of Congress to urge President Biden to release the rule now. Yesterday. So you can do that. We'll paste the link into the chat for how you can look up your legislator. But it's as simple as that. Reach out to folks, give them a call. You can also reach out to your local legislators and have them reach out to members of Congress or to President Biden as well. In Philadelphia, one of the city council members is creating a city council resolution to also urge, right? So this can be local efforts, or you can reach out to, again, your federal members of Congress to urge them to urge the president to release the rule. And I will pass it to Michael to share some other ways to get involved.
Sure. So in addition to directly contacting your member of Congress, there's also other ways that you can get involved. One of which is actually going to be happening tomorrow. So I urge all of you attending this webinar, and feel free to share this as well, to join the National Low Income Housing Coalition and our partners across the country for a tweet storm happening tomorrow at 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That's Tuesday, May 30th. Calling on President Biden and the White House to release the final affirmatively furthering fair housing rule immediately. If you go to the next slide, what we can do is, these are just some of the sample tweets that you can share. Again, I'm not going to go over all of them. There is a bunch, and we'll be sure to circulate this after today's webinar, but you can take a look for reference. Once you receive a copy of this PowerPoint, we also had a chat posted on the, we also have the link to the document with all these sample tweets and sample images that you can use for tomorrow's tweet storm on the chat. And again, those will be made available after today's webinar. So really, really looking forward to all of you joining tomorrow's tweet storm to make as loud a noise as possible to get the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule implemented by the Biden administration. So with that, why don't we go ahead and move along with the questions and answers portion of our webinar. So we have a bunch of questions coming in on the Q&A box. Again, highly encourage everyone to ask any questions that you may have. And I'll just read out some of these questions, and I'm hoping that our other panelists can step up and answer some of these questions. So the first question that came in is, how can AFFH rule benefit tenants who experience discrimination from private landlords? Is that even possible? Anyone want to take that question?
I can take a first crack at it. This is, again, with the National Fair Housing Alliance. The affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate and the local planning process that would be required under the proposed rule would require the state or the local jurisdiction, the city or the public housing authority, to account for public and private discrimination that has happened historically and has manifested segregated neighborhoods, and that it is happening in an ongoing fashion in different ways. And so that would require accounting for and analyzing the private landlords that might be operating in the market, that they're responsible for administering these HUD funds in and operating in and carrying out this fair housing analysis in. And so the equity plan would have to account for those private factors. Obviously, that's outside of the control of the local jurisdiction, but the local jurisdiction would have to take all of that into account, and then the equity plan that it produced and the goals that it identifies about how to deal with these different issues around segregation and discrimination. And happy for others to add to that.
I would just add, thanks for that, Morgan, and thanks for the question. A part of the plan, putting together the equity plan, and that's we believe that was in the proposed rule, and we believe will be in the final rule, is mandated participation from the community. So it's not like they will go off in a corner and do it by themselves. They have to reach out to you, and you should reach out to them to bring those kinds of experiences to their attention so that they can see it. You can bring whatever data you have, but you can also bring, here are the experiences of the folks we work with. This needs to be handled. It is an impediment to fair housing. It is an impediment to the economic and welfare of our folks. And they can put into that plan things that don't particularly fall into their jurisdiction too. They can do things like, in some places they did recommendations for a right to counsel in an eviction process. They can recommend that laws be passed, and can be a huge boost to campaigns, local campaigns and state campaigns.
Thanks. So the next question is, how can improvements in public transportation infrastructure help address disparities in access to housing opportunities for minorities in our communities? I want to take a crack at that.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate what Morgan was sharing and what I shared earlier is that part of the equity planning process, or what we believe will be called the equity plan, what's formerly called the assessment of fair housing, includes that cross-sector engagement. And so when jurisdictions are assessing what are the barriers to fair housing, what are the things that are, preventing people from being able to access housing or to be able to access communities that are stable, safe, affordable, transportation is part of the consideration. And so what that might look like, for example, is while jurisdictions are building their equity plan, they're going to the Department of Transportation, getting data, including that data about, where our transportation is located, how close it's located to housing, accessible housing, things like that. So that's another issue that for folks who are in the transportation sector, or for people who are organizing or advocating around this through that community engagement process as the equity plan is being built out, these are things that you want to bring up. These are things that you want to raise. And one of the things that we dropped into the chat is a comment guide that we put out last year when the rule was out for public comment. Within that is a cross-sector guide that just has some tips and some ways in which other sectors are involved in housing, should be involved in sort of the housing issues. So you can take a look at that, and that has some suggestions and ideas as well as for how transportation shows up in an equity planning process.
Thank you. The next question is, will the AFFH rule have any impact on the development of affordable housing projects that are proposed by private developers to a city's planning and development department? Take a crack at that.
I'll take a first crack. It's a great question. The affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate requires looking at issues of segregation and housing equity. And there's various lenses that you can use to analyze that. But one that you would undertake is consideration of issues of barriers to home ownership along racial lines and other demographic lines. And that's routinely a part of these assessments that jurisdictions have done under this mandate. And, part of that is understanding kind of different ways to address gap in home ownership, a racial gap in home ownership in many jurisdictions. And certainly a function of the solution is, the emergence of different special purpose credit programs and other housing programs that might benefit those that have been traditionally underserved, but also the supply side dynamics of the economics of housing is that affordability is a function of supply. And so the development of more housing is going to help to address some of those broader issues around affordability and promote a solution that could be meeting needs around housing equity as they relate to affordable housing and the need for more development along the lines of the question that was asked. So that would be one answer. I'm sure there's a lot more that people would add, though.
Yeah, I was thinking just along those lines, if cities are taking a very broad approach to how they're awarding, trying to encourage their private developers that are working, trying to get tax credits or anything that has that angle, pushing policies that are awarding those tax credits towards developers that are upholding the AFFH angles, towards projects that are committed to work with community organizations, putting projects into areas that have routinely struggled to get affordable housing or get services. There's a lot of government funded routes or tax credits that have been created to foster a private public partnership or foster private development, but have maybe traditionally had a rather hands-off approach from the federal government or lower down. This could be an opportunity to to expand that work. And if those tax credits are being pushed out, whether it's low-income housing tax credit or anything like that, make sure they're being pushed out towards projects that have more of an inclusive and expansive lens that is going to fully take into account what a community needs, whether it's the LGBTQ+ community, whether it is the Black community, whether there's any community that has failed to really break into the traditional housing developer space. But I think that's an opportunity as well for advocates to get creative for how they're pressuring their local governments to follow the money there.
Thank you. So the next question is, do the equity plans have to track the demographic makeup of newly homeless populations? Is that something that could be considered or included in the equity plan?
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Morgan. Yeah, I don't know that, and I would have to go back and look at the rule. In a lot of cases, it's not that prescriptive where it's requiring jurisdictions to do look at very specific factors. But I think, right, that is something that you could push or ask or advocate for your community to look at that specific factor. I'm gonna paste into the chat a resource as well about how homelessness and unhoused issues interact with the AFFH from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And so they have some more materials there as well for how the two things intersect and how you can advocate for those issues to be more prominent in a future equity plan.
I think this goes back to, so the next question is, I think this goes back to both AFFH and the Fair Housing Act, but does national origin include immigration status? No one would take that.
It's a great question. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act, national origin is defined by the country from where you or your relatives or ancestry comes from. And so immigration status as a kind of legal status is not protected, but one's ethnic identity in association with their immigrant status is protected, as I guess a short answer. There may be local protections and state that expand beyond the Federal Fair Housing Act to include immigration status. I actually don't know that offhand. I'd look to like California's list of protections if there's anyone. I know there's folks that are based there that might know that offhand, but you also want to be sensitive that there are some states and localities that do have specific protections that expand beyond what is considered sort of protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act.
Thank you. The next question came in as, and I think we might have touched on this before, so feel free to just recap or rehash, but does AFFH provide for an increase of low-income affordable housing, and love to see an increase of this housing supply in communities? Yeah.
Yes, they can include that, yes.
Okay.
Local equity plans, or again, what was formerly called the Assessment of Fair Housing, frequently does include those kinds of provisions and strategies in it.
So this other question just came in. What do AFFH's equity plans include for local communities? Can you share more about what some of the solutions that they recommend, if you can, off the top of your head? Anyone want to take a crack at that?
So I was going to add this to the last one. And then somebody can do the more of the specifics because I don't remember. But to Rasheedah's point, there's, this particular version of the rule is a little less prescriptive, and you have to look up this piece of data and that piece of data and that piece of data and that piece of data. But it is in other ways more of an overview. And he has to say, you really have to, in your equity plan, cover the bases. And what this rule has that pasts have not is an enforcement mechanism. So if there's something in there, like they didn't, we offered and we suggested that they look at who is becoming newly homeless. We offered and said, you have to look at exactly how many more affordable units at 30% you have to build. And they didn't. You can challenge the plan with HUD. You being just the community can actually say they didn't get the job done. So even when, there isn't something specifically in the rule and you can say, aha, you didn't look at this one thing. You can say by not looking at this one thing, you've done an inadequate job of looking at of what we need in our community and challenge that if it comes to that. But to the specifics, I will pass to my colleagues.
Yeah, I can say for Philadelphia, the strategies that we identified in our 2017 Assessment of Fair Housing, and then Philadelphia did an updated 2022 Assessment of Fair Housing. The strategies ranged from from housing discrimination to housing production, tenants issues, home ownership issues, homelessness issues, right? Our AFH was a robust 600 something pages because it had data across all of those issues. It had, again, it did a look into things like transportation, education issues, and I'll pop the link into for the Philadelphia Assessment of Fair Housing so you can get a overview of what an assessment plan looks like and what a future equity plan might look like. And again, there's some differences between the two, as Liz shared. But again, the strategies can really range. And one of the things that we were able to get placed into our assessment of fair housing was a lot of things related to tenant issues. So prior to that assessment of fair housing, a lot of the resources in the city of Philadelphia that was coming from HUD related to things like community development block grants and other things were focused on home ownership issues. And there was really very few protections, resources available to tenants. And through that AFH process, we were able to get this, make tenant issues a priority, develop strategies, things like right to counsel, just cause eviction, things that were put into the assessment of fair housing. And just because it's in there, right, doesn't mean that the city has to act on it, but it's an accountability document, right? And now as Liz talked about, right, there is an enforcement mechanism that comes along with it that wasn't there before. But it's a tool for us to build on, you know, and to continue pushing for protections. And it's something that we can go back to and said, this is what the city identified as a strategy, as a thing. And right, there's also goals related to those strategies. And so you have a benchmark where you can look back and say, look, we didn't make any progress on this one versus this one. We did make some progress. So I'll pop in the 2017 Philadelphia AFH and the 2022. And if you're curious, you can take a look and sort of compare and contrast. But that's an example of what we hope future equity plans will look like as well.
Thanks. So we're running low on time in terms of answering questions. I'm going to pivot a little bit and try to answer some of the questions that came in from folks who actually registered. And if our panelists will be gracious enough to answer some of those remaining questions on the Q&A box, please do so, time permitting. But just those three questions that were asked prior to the beginning of the webinar, what voice and power do people with housing choice vouchers and subsidies have at decision-making tables when it comes to the AFFH rule? Is that something that there's room for them? How can they get engaged? Maybe we can just like have one person answer, and then I'll move on to the next question, just so that we have time to answer all the other questions that came in.
Well, I think this goes into the important part of this new rule is the community input. Those receiving or using the vouchers are part of the community, where before you may have cities who were deciding on their own what are the priorities they need to set with HUD, and then going forward, the spirit of the rule is the cities are forced to work with actively members of the community that are impacted by housing and to address the issues that are leading to housing discrimination broadly. So those members of the community need to be at the table when these plans are being made. And if for some reason they're in a city or an area that is continuing to ignore them when their voices are trying to be heard, who aren't listening to them, they now have a tool underneath where they can go directly to HUD and say, you know, we were in a city and the city said they were listening to us, but they didn't, right? They did what they did before, and all they did is they promised they were going to, and they did. So that is a new tool. They're members of the community just like everyone else, even if in the past, the cities would prefer to focus on how do we increase middle-class homeownership, which is great, it's important, but it's time to focus beyond that and focus beyond how can federal funding expand all types of that. So I say that falls into the broader thing of what we talked about. All members of the community here need to be part of that process, and this is the opportunity the tool has to be part of the planning. And if you're not, we should have HUD is supposed to be on the side now, and HUD should be ready and willing to use those tools.
Great. We have room for one question, so I'm going to combine these two. What is the strategy, and maybe we can save this for another future webinar, right? What's the strategy for advocates if a future administration unwinds or does not enforce this new fair housing rule? And how can advocates utilize this rule to protect tenants when local governments leave it up to the state to enforce the Fair Housing Act? Anyone want to take like a 30-second crack at that?
I can do that in 15. So we have experience with this, right? We know what it looks like to have this rule, then this law, and a lot of our protections under attack from an unfriendly, to put it mildly, administration. I'm not going to pretend that isn't real, and I'm not going to pretend that isn't a fear, but we know how to fight back, and we're going to continue to do so. And we will help make sure you have every ammo you need and can get to continue to fight back as well. And on the second half, I'll leave to somebody else.
I'll just
Morgan?
add that, you know, as Michael noted at the start, there is also the judiciary, and this is a component of the law, and it has meant something in the courts, and we can continue to press it to mean something in the courts moving forward.
Sounds like a room for future discussion on a future webinar. So thank you all so much for asking all these questions and answering all these questions that came in. And I know there's like a few left. So again, if folks have time to answer those, that would be great. Before we close out, we have a few questions to ask. Again, these are just some exit polling questions, hoping that our colleagues could help launch that. And I'm going to read it out loud once we have it up. So 2 questions, actually 3 questions. I'm going to read them out loud. How much do you agree with the following statement? I found this webinar helpful and informative. And again, similar choices as earlier: strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. The second question is, how much do you agree with the following statement? I plan to use what I learned from this webinar to advance my advocacy. I plan to take some actions provided from this webinar. Again, choices are strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. And the last question, quite important as well, equally important, is what additional programming would you like us to feature in the coming months on the Fair Housing Act and Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing proposed rule? So I'll give it another 10 seconds, and then I'll hand it over to Rasheedah to close us out.
All right, so as y'all are taking that poll, I just want to thank all of the panelists, Michael, Josh, Liz, Morgan. Thank you so much again to our ASL interpreters, and thank you all for showing up. And also would love to thank my colleagues at PolicyLink, Jasmine and Jen, for your help behind the scenes. And yeah, we hope that you all will stay engaged. Again, join our tweet storm tomorrow. We will send out the recording and the links as soon as possible. And yes, we look forward to seeing you next time. And again, reach out to us if there's other topics related to the AFFH that you would like us to get into. As you know, this one was set up very quickly. We wanted to do this before the end of April so that we could make sure that we take the action that was needed to get the rule released. But after this, we would like to set up some additional educational topics to share more about the AFFH. So please let us know if there's a particular topic that you would like us to cover. Thank you again.
Bye. Thank you.